Hello, everybody. My name is Toby Varland. I am the Vice President of Technology for Varland Plating in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about how we have modernized our industrial IoT monitoring with Grafana visualization. Grafana has been a real godsend for my company. We're a small to medium company, so unlike some of the big guys out there, we don't have a nearly limitless budget for this sort of thing. So Grafana has really filled a need for us, and I think it probably can for you too if you're in a similar position. So hopefully what I'm able to tell you today will be helpful, and you'll be able to see some of the same benefits that I have. A little bit about my company, Varland Plating. We are located in Cincinnati, Ohio. We've been in business since 1946, and we are a job shop electroplating company. We don't manufacture anything in-house, but electroplating is a electrochemical process by which we take manufactured parts made out of metal, whether it be steel or brass or copper, and we put a metal finishing on those parts for one of a variety of purposes. Sometimes it's decorative, sometimes it's corrosion resistance, sometimes it's for electrical properties, brazing, other things like that. So my facility is a very industrial facility. Our plating lines are these room-sized machines that you can see in the picture on the screen. We load a couple 100 pounds of parts generally into a barrel, which is moved throughout a series of chemical dips. Electric current is applied at the right time to actually cause the metal to stick to the parts. And it's a fairly complicated process with a lot of different variables from chemistry, the pH of the different tanks and the chemical makeup of those tanks, to the temperature of the tanks, to the speed at which the barrel rotates in those tanks, to the amount of electric current applied. And all of that is stuff that we have to monitor and we have to be able to analyze in our process in order to make sure that we are getting good parts out. So we do a variety of different types of parts. These are some nickel-plated parts. We have, I believe these are also nickel-plated parts, but we do parts in a variety of configurations, a variety of sizes. These are some screws that you could actually go buy at Lowe's. But since we're a job shop and we don't manufacture things, we have to be prepared on a daily basis to handle whatever hits our receiving docks. We do work for a couple hundred companies throughout the country. We see thousands of different types of parts, and our aim is to turn everything around in 3 to 5 business days, which we're pretty good at. So we rely a lot on automation to be able to help us get these things done. But part of a successful automation strategy is being able to monitor and use the data that comes out of that strategy to make better business decisions. Before we ever got into Grafana, we've relied heavily on a product called Opto22. And Opto22 makes hardware and software. They make PLCs, which we really rely on. And a PLC is just a programmable logic controller, a specialized computer, often used in industrial purposes. We go through, you'll see on the screen here, a couple different generations of these things, which have everything from inputs and outputs that are connected via serial to inputs and outputs that are connected via Ethernet. And those inputs and outputs connect to all different types of industrial equipment within our plant, be it a Allen Bradley hoist system or variable frequency drives for controlling exhausts and barrel motors, to temperature probes, to rectifiers, to limit switches, to optical sensors, you name it. All of those things we connect to our Opto22 controllers, and we need to be able to monitor those things in-house. So one of the things that has been a challenge is before we started using Grafana, Opto22 is what we use to do our human machine interface and it served as our data historian, even though it's not completely designed to be a data historian. We were able to make it work for a long time. And I really love the Opto22 products. I would encourage you to check them out if you're looking for these types of sensors and input-output modules and a very easy-to-use control system. But unfortunately, Opto is just not designed as a full data historian, and that's something that we were missing. With Opto22, here's kind of an example of one of our graphs. And It looks a little better than the screenshot shows, but not always a ton. These optographs are limited to being line graphs only. The configuration all has to be done before you start graphing your data. When you want to go back into history, this particular graph logs files 1 week at a time. So you click a little button on the screen and it allows you to choose which week you want to view. And then you can use the buttons over here on the side to scroll backwards and forwards through that data. You set up when you're going through the configuration where, this runs on Windows only. So where you want to log data, how many files to retain, what's the rollover, all that sort of stuff. You configure your x-axis and y-axis. In this case, it's set up for a 4-hour x-axis, but they do have a zoom function, which allows me to zoom in or out to 24 hours or 1 hour. And then each graph has a number of pens, which are what Opto calls their data points. And you can have up to 16 of these on one graph. Each one is configured. It points to a variable on one of the PLCs or an input-output point. And you set up your axis scaling and the color and the width and a few different things. But all in all, we found the system to be really, really limiting for us because you have to do all this configuration ahead of time. And it's this one piece of software that handles the data collection and the logging and the presentation, which we'll get into some of the reasons why that's a little bit less than ideal in our situation. So our solution to some of these challenges has been to deploy what I've come to learn is called a TIG stack. And TIG is a stack that includes Telegraph, InfluxDB, and Grafana. Most of this is going to focus on Grafana, but Telegraph and Influx are also invaluable pieces of software for us. Telegraph is actually made by InfluxDB, but it is a service that collects data or metrics from devices and services in our factory and sends those things to InfluxDB. It can also send things to an MQTT broker or a variety of other services, but our primary use is sending data to InfluxDB. InfluxDB, if you're not familiar, is a time series database that allows you to store all kinds of data. It allows tagging data, multiple values in a data point, but it's all optimized for time series data, which all of our sensor and processing data from within our plant, that's what that really is. And then I'm guessing if you're here, you're already aware that Grafana is the visualization platform that we use to display and contextualize the data that we store in InfluxDB. And we also use it to present data from a variety of other sources. Grafana, I'm not really going to get into it in this presentation, but it can handle anything from JSON data to an almost endless supply of data. You can check out all the plugins. I've barely scratched the surface. But for our purposes, we've been using Influx to store our data and Grafana to view it. One of the reasons I've had people ask, why did we deploy this TIG stack? And one of the biggest reasons is there are almost no barriers to entry with this. And it's one of the things that's been just incredibly helpful for me. All three of these products that I'm using, Telegraph, InfluxDB, and Grafana, I'm running the on-premise open source versions of these things, which is great. I have the picture up here of these Mac Minis. I run a lot of things on Mac Minis when I can. And all three of these services, if you're not familiar, Homebrew is a package manager for the Mac, but you can install Homebrew, install each of these services, get them running, and literally have the whole thing up and running within about 10 minutes. Even without having data in there, Grafana is set up to have some kind of built-in data sources to simulate data for you so that you can play around with the different types of visualizations and everything before going too far down the road of committing to a platform. And this has been really key for me because over the years, I've sat through a lot of sales pitches and a lot of presentations from other companies who are wanting to sell me something. And there's this endless, it feels like, run of they're going to come in for a meeting and present something, and then they're going to go back and put a quote together for me. And then I review the quote and I have to change something. And then it's 2 more days until I get a quote. And in the time that whole process takes, I'm up and running with this solution. Beyond that, when you install these open source versions, you've got the full-fledged product and you can start using it right away. Whereas so many other products that I've looked at over the years, you have a demo that is limited to, well, you can chart 3 data points, or you can run the demo for 12 minutes, or you can get into the demo for configuration, but you can't actually do anything with it. And those are all real scenarios that I've encountered that with this TIG stack and with Grafana, you just don't have any of that. And as I mentioned, being a smaller business, I don't have an endless budget for this stuff. And some of the other solutions I've considered over the years, they want a $5,000 developer license per seat for anybody who's going to be doing the development. And it's not going to work for my business. And I know it doesn't work for a lot of you. So with this TIG stack, with Grafana, Influx, Telegraph, getting up and running, you can literally do it on one PC. I got started on a MacBook Air laptop that's no special computer, and I was amazed within about an hour. So there's almost nothing standing in the way of getting started. So I want to talk about some of the benefits that we've seen with this, some of the problems it solved for us. One of the first benefits for us is just the architecture of the TIG stack in Grafana versus our old Opto solution, which is not specific to Opto, but there's a lot of products that kind of work that way. With these services, with the background services, the TIG stack on the left versus Opto, the client application on the right, the TIG stack splits the data collection, storage, and visualization, into separate components, which means that each thing is specialized and each thing really excels at doing one thing and doing it really well, versus our Opto solution, which was a single Windows application, which handled all parts of the historization, from the collection to the storage to the display, which just leads to trade-offs because it's one component of what Opto does and it's not really designed for that. So we'll get into some of those trade-offs, but it works, but it doesn't do anything nearly as well as these other components. With these things being background services and with them being separate components, I'm able to run them on separate and or optimized hardware versus obviously a single application can only be running on a single piece of hardware, and that leads to a single point of failure, which I'm sure many of us in the industrial world are familiar with and we try to avoid at all costs. Telegraph is probably the most processor intensive of these things in my experience. So I'm able to run that on a little bit more powerful machine and let that go out over the network and collect everything. Grafana needs a little bit of memory since you may have a bunch of different users connecting to it. But since they're all separate, I can customize the hardware for each one of those things, customize the network setup for each one of those things, and they all work fantastic. As a server application, Grafana is designed for multiple simultaneous remote client connections. Since it's served over a browser, I can have 10 different people looking at the same graph at different time frames, and Grafana handles it fine. With my Opto solution or some of the other kind of single application solutions, you can only have one person looking at it at a time, and the only way to do that remotely is with something like VNC or remote desktop. So that's been a nice change. Going down the list, Grafana and Influx support redundancy and high availability configurations, which is a little beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but it can be done, which is fantastic. Obviously, a piece of software running on one PC, it's harder to do redundancy and high availability. And then the last thing is maybe the most important, because the collection and storage and visualization are all separate. Grafana allows multiple types of visualization, and I can configure different types of visualization and analysis for the same data after the data is already being stored in InfluxDB. Whereas with my Opto solution, I have to configure all that at the same time. And if I want to see two variables together, a temperature and a pressure, for example, I have to configure that and then start charting, and I can't combine those things later with historical data because all Opto is able to do is display the data file that it's already saved. It's not able to really do any statistical analysis or aggregation or combining of the data. So for all those reasons, just the architecture of this stack has solved a ton of problems for us. And it's been really nice to know that I can update Grafana, restart that server, know that the Telegraph and Influx are still collecting my data and I'm not missing anything. So that's been a big benefit to us. As I mentioned, one of the next big benefits is there's just a huge variety of different types of visualization that you can get from Grafana out of the box. And if you can't find what you need out of the box, there's a great community, which has a ton of other different options for visualization. So whatever you can dream of, you can probably find. And if not, there's a bunch of resources for how to build it. So build it and share it with the rest of us and let us all benefit from that. This dashboard, which is just a little energy monitoring dashboard in my building, shows just a couple of the different types of visualization. These larger numbers at the top are what's called a stat panel, which can include a graph. These don't, but in this case, it's just displaying, the last value of a certain metric during the time period I have selected. Obviously, down in the middle, I have a line graph, which has a number of different lines. And one thing that's nice that, again, my previous solution couldn't do is I can have some lines that are solid lines. I can have some that are dashed. I can have some that are large dashes, some that are small dashes. You can shade in areas under the line. You can shade threshold areas above the line. You can do pretty much whatever you can imagine with a line graph. You can stack your series rather than plotting them one on top of each other. So that's really nice. The bottom is an actual histogram, which is really great for my purposes because, again, my previous Opto solution couldn't do any sort of, data aggregation like that. So that's been nice. Another dashboard I use, I have some tables up at the top, which you can set custom highlight rules to highlight your cells on those tables. The middle blue lines there is what's called a state timeline, which is great for tracking an on-off or any sort of variable where there's one of a predefined number of different values. Again, with a line graph, you can graph an on-off, but it's just kind of a 1-0. With this, you can actually assign, as you see here, my 1, it's going to say okay instead of 1. A 0, it would say failure. So that state timeline is another nice alternative. Some more table data, and then there's actually an example of a line graph at the bottom, which has some shaded areas, and it's a little bit tough to see, but in the bottom corner, it's also showing, min and max values from that data, whatever the last value was. So again, you can have some quick statistical analysis right on some of these visualizations. So that's been nice. The next benefit that I've talked about a little bit already is just this aggregation and data analysis. And what this really means with our Opto solution, with a lot of other solutions, all Opto is doing is taking each data point in its file and graphing it. So if you have a 1,000 pixel wide graph on your screen and you have 2,000 data points, it's just going to overlap those data points because there's nothing else that it can do. With Grafana, you can see these query options up in the top left. It's kind of saying, hey, your max data point is the width of the panel, and based on whatever time range you have selected, in this case, it's giving me an interval of 15 seconds. If I was looking at 6 months worth of data, my interval might be every day or every hour, but Grafana basically handles all of that smartly for me. And then in the bottom left is my actual query where I'm getting data from Influx. And that aggregate window function, what that says is the function to run is last. So what I'm telling Influx to do is give me the last data point within every 15-second window in this case. But you can also run, give me the mean data point, give me the maximum data point, give me the minimum data point. You can do a whole bunch of different things depending on what suits your data best. And then over on the right is, okay, once I've even gotten that data from Influx, if I'm going to have something like a stat panel, I can say, give me the maximum value of all of these data points over my entire time range, or give me the number of data points, or the total, or the range, or there's just a huge range of statistical analysis that you can do depending on what your data demands that can give better insight to those people using your data. Another benefit with these Grafana graphs is there's a built-in ability to do annotations on your graphs. You can see the little section about a third of the way into the graph with the blue dashed lines and the annotation message at the bottom. And that's something where, any user can click and drag on a section of a graph and add one of these annotations, which then anybody else using the graph can see. So this was one that honestly I added a little bit more for demonstration purposes, but I'm tracking the size of some files, and I had a spot where I deleted some files, and it's very unusual for this data to ever shrink. So I went in and put in an annotation to let my other IT guys know, if you're looking at this graph and you see the data shrink, don't be alarmed. I did this on purpose. But whether it's process data or anything else, being able to annotate right within the data itself means that any future person who comes and looks at that data gets the benefit of the context that you're adding, which is a really nice thing. And then the last real benefit that I want to talk about today is Grafana's ability to do templating and have variable data within a dashboard and within a query. So this picture up here at the top left shows, for one of my dashboards, I have 3 variables: a source and a lane and a station. My source is one of the coolest things that they do, is actually that the configuration for that's over here on the right. That's a data source variable, and the type of that is InfluxDB. And I run what Influx called a poor man's high availability solution with my Influx, where I have 2 Influx servers that are all basically getting a copy of the data. That way, if one of them goes down, hopefully the other one gets the data. So I can have this data source variable where Grafana will go pull any InfluxDB instance that I have configured, put it in this dropdown, and let my user select where they're pulling the data from. So if there's a chunk missing out of a graph, they can drop down, go to my other Influx server, which I have 2. You could have 10 if you wanted to for different purposes. And then right over here, when I'm actually configuring my query in my data source, I'm using that source variable, and that's what kind of does all the magic here. With these lane and station variables, that's actually in the Flux query I'm sending to Influx. You can't really see here, but in my variable name, you might be able to see here, I'm starting to use that lane variable. I also use that station variable. So that's just been a huge benefit for me. Again, with my old Opto solution, if I wanted to have, a graph of lane 2, station 7, station 8, station 9, station 10, I could create a graph for station 7 and then copy it for 8 and copy it for 9 and copy it for 10 and so on and so forth. But then if I had to make any change to that, I had to go change it on each one of those things individually, because once you start logging the history, you have to keep modifying that one, not recopying, or else you lose your history. The other real benefit to these variables is when you change these dropdowns and you change these variables, it stores those variable values in the query string of your Grafana dashboard. So if you find something that you're looking at and you want to share it with somebody else, you can just send them a link to whatever you're looking at, and everything from the time range to the variable values, everything you're looking at is right there in that query string. So it makes it super easy to share data without having to deal with screenshots or trying to get the screen set and having somebody look at it right now. And all that's possible because of this templating and variables. So once you actually have those things set up, you can see here, it's super fast. I'm just dropping down and selecting a couple of different stations. And as soon as I select different stations, the data changes immediately. But the data changes, but the overall format stays the same. So there's no risk of inconsistency across different stations for the same sort of data. So I think those are the big things I wanted to hit on today. I know that was fast, and there's many more things that I could cover. Everything from, Grafana easily integrating with Google authentication to storing versions of my dashboards, but hopefully that's enough to kind of get you interested and help you see some of the benefits that Grafana may have for you and your organization. I thank you for joining and allowing me to come share my experience. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference and that you get as much out of Grafana as I have.
Hello, everybody. I thank you for being here. I've seen a few questions come in from you guys that I'll try to answer quickly. We've got about 5 minutes for these questions. So if I don't hit on something or you want more information, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk more beyond this Q&A. One of the questions I got is which telegraph input plugins I'm using. I'm using some of kind of the basic ones that are set up a lot of times for monitoring CPU and memory usage. I don't remember exactly what they're called, but they're very easy to find. And then the big thing that I found that helps me is I'm using the exec and execd plugins, which allow me to run a custom script The exec-D allows me to daemonize that script and run it in the background and keep it running, which has been great for me because Telegraph then somewhat acts as a process monitor a little bit. And if my script has an error and stops, then Telegraph will automatically restart it. So those are the big ones for me as exec and exec-D. Somebody asked me how many time series I'm collecting. And right now with my Opto data, I mean, I'm using mainly one bucket in Influx, but I am storing hundreds of different variable values over time in that one bucket. So, and I have plans to do a lot more, and so far Influx has handled all of that very, very easily. With Grafana, when I'm using Influx, I got started with this fairly recently, and Influx 2 was already out or coming out. So I decided, since it looked like Flux was kind of the future of Influx, I went ahead and did all of my queries in Flux, and I'm not using any of the older Influx query language. Somebody asked if it's possible to kick off an automation from an alert, for example, to restart an application or to shut down a device. And admittedly, I have not actually gotten into using alerts too much in Grafana yet, though I do know that one of the things that you could do is you could kick off an email, and it's fairly easy to set up something like Node-RED to monitor an email account and look at a subject, and you could very easily kick off an automation from there. So I don't know that it's built in, but it would definitely be possible to do. Somebody asked about my Mac server rack and if that's horizontal scaling or if I'm kind of running all the different components on each Mac Mini. And in my case right now, I am using each one kind of has a dedicated purpose. So I have one Mac Mini that's running Telegraph that's connecting to a bunch of different devices, and I have two that are running Influx in kind of that high availability setup, and one that's running an MQTT broker and one that's running Grafana, so that things are fairly centralized instead of running all of the different components on each Mac Mini itself. Somebody asked about my retention period. Again, I'm somewhat new to this. I haven't been running this stuff for years and years, but right now I have it set to an unlimited retention period. I've also been asked if I kind of aggregate or reduce the data for historical purposes, and I have not yet done that, but there is a chance that in the future I will summarize the data a little bit so that I'm not storing quite the same granularity long term. Though there's a part of me that says if the system can handle it, maybe I'll just leave it out there because it makes it simple. Somebody asked which Telegraph input plugins are most useful for actually connecting to the newer generation of Opto devices, which are their Groove Epic and Groove Rio devices. And I don't know that I can answer the question other than to say that I have written some custom scripts, which are actually PHP, which connect to the REST API on those devices. And essentially now they put data out into the standard output console, and Telegraph handles getting those things to Influx for me. So if you have more questions about that, reach out and I'm happy to help with that. Someone asked if the Telegraph agent requires a lot of memory or CPU, and I've not found that to be the case. Again, running this on a base level Mac Mini with Telegraph being the primary thing running, I'm finding my CPU usage is normally less than 5%. Memory usage on a machine with 8 gigs of RAM is generally in the 30 to 40% range. So I've not had any trouble with Telegraph. And then I was asked when Grafana is showing up on the factory floor, and I use it in a variety of cases around our factory just to provide nice visualizations to our line operators. Again, the primary reason I started setting it up was to help with historical data, but it also does help with real-time data. So I think that pretty much answers most of the questions. If I missed something, I'm sorry, but we're just about out of time. Again, if you have anything else, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help out. I know this community's benefited me a lot, and I'm happy to give back in any way that I can. So again, I appreciate you guys being here for my presentation, and hopefully I'll get to connect with some of you beyond this presentation as well.